Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Ponsonby and Massey podcast. As always, we are very keen to hear from you, your observations, your thoughts, your questions. You can get in touch with us at ponsonbymassey@gmail.com, and our Twitter handle is also ponsonbymassey. For this episode, I'm delighted to say that we're addressing one of the key questions that is arising out of this campaign. Who precisely is Keir Starmer? And to help us answer that, I'm also delighted to say that we're joined by a man who knows as much about Keir Starmer as anybody outside his immediate family, perhaps, which is Tom Baldwin, Keir Starmer's biographer. I should say not the first person to have written a book about Keir Starmer, but comfortably the person who has written the best book about Keir Starmer. I would recommend Tom's biography of Starmer to all of you listening. I'm holding it up for those of you who are watching on our YouTube channel or on Facebook, and I would encourage you to subscribe to either of those to keep in touch with us and our future plans. It's Tom's book about Keir Starmer is the essential guide, I think, to the man who is almost certain to be our next Prime Minister. Tom, before we get into the detail of Starmer, his life, his career, what sort of Prime Minister he might be, could you just tell us a little bit about how the book came to be? Because it had a slightly unusual birth, I think, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, initially I was asked to help him put together an autobiography. I mean, it's sort of a euphemism for sort of ghosting it, really. And we had some meetings and sort of quite interesting meetings in a way because he was very much in control of what might be written then. And I think that's part of what's good about the book in a way. There's a kind of degree of internality, which I don't think you'd have got if we had gone straight into a biography. There's a sort of, he's talking about what's inside his head quite a lot. But after a while of doing this, it became really clear to me he didn't want an autobiography. He didn't want 350 pages of him talking about himself. He felt really uncomfortable about that. And that sort of slightly sets him apart from most politicians I know who like nothing more than talking about themselves. But he genuinely felt agonized about how he might come across if it was just him. So I said, we went for a meeting in a pub and I said, let's kill the autobiography. And he said, well, yeah, that's what I plan to tell you. And I said, well, we can do a biography, but it can't be entirely controlled by you because no one won't have any credibility. And he said, no, that's fine. And so he gave me quite a lot of freedom and access to talk to his friends and his family and carry on talking to him. And the result is what I'm calling an authoritative biography, but not an authorised one.
Yeah, so semi-authorized sort of thing. But
written with his cooperation, yeah.
Yeah. Bernard, over to you.
Tom, I suppose one of the issues for Labour people, because I talk to a lot of Labour Party members who say, I'm not really sure where he comes from. If we go back through previous Labour leaders, from Harold Wilson to Jim Callaghan to Michael Foot to Neil Kinnock, to John Smith, even to Blair, who you could go back to his Islington days, his CND days, his Beaconsfield by-election days, they'll say, where does Keir Starmer actually come from politically? So that's my first question. Where does he come from politically?
Politically, I mean, he came from a left-wing family. The reason why he's called Keir for a reason, after the first leader of the Labour Party. And his dad was this quite old-fashioned, rather imposing, Guardian-reading socialist with a sort of Amish-style beard without a moustache. And they were probably, it's like the only socialists in the village in a way. They had sort of miners' strike posters and fire brigade posters and Labour posters up in Hurst Green, Surrey in the 1970s, and that was probably made him quite unusual. But he's not someone who feels particularly political. I think that's why people ask this question. He doesn't have the kind of classic, working class boy made good story or the Blair story of, I wasn't born into the Labour Party, I became Labour. He was very Labour, came from a Labour Party family, but then kind of left politics. He became a lawyer. But no one's interested in your politics, really. He doesn't win court cases on the basis that, his dad was a toolmaker and his mum was a nurse. He doesn't win. You don't have a backstory as a lawyer. You have an argument in court. You don't have a vision as a lawyer. You have evidence. And I think he kind of drove out quite a lot of the kind of political kind of communication symbols from his personality in the 3 decades he spent as a lawyer. And so, he does have a working class background. He's probably the most working class leader of the Labour Party since Neil Kinnock. He does talk about class and snobbery, but it's always done in a slightly different way. He speaks in terms of values rather than ideology. It's very hard to place him on a political spectrum in a way that most people wouldn't place themselves on a political spectrum. They have values which are hard to codify, but they don't really act or feel as political as most people in politics assume everyone else does. But of course, very few people do.
Yeah, I mean,
just before you jump in there,
yeah.
Just before you jump in there, I get all of that, and I understand all of that, and the only socialists in the village, the posters for the miners, and all the rest of it. If you had to say about Harold Wilson, you would have said, well, he started off on the soft left, and everybody knew he was really on the centre ground of the party. Everybody knew that Hugh Gaitskell and Tony Crosland came from a certain ideological perspective. Everybody knew where Michael Foot and Neil Kinnock's politics came from. They were perhaps driven more by emotion, although there was a lot of ideology in there as well. John Smith was from a social democratic position. Blair and Brown championed this notion of the third way, which I have to hold up my hands, and having looked at politics for a long number of years, I'm still not clear what it means. I can just about pigeonhole every previous Labour leader with reference points to ideological debates within the history of the Labour Party. I still can't get a handle on Keir Starmer. We know he's not a Clause 4 socialist. Is he a classic social democrat?
I don't think he's a classic anything. I think he's progressive. I think he has Labour values, but it's just futile trying to pin a label on him. I mean, in the leadership debate, it's very interesting. He's up against Rebecca Long-Bailey, who was seen as the Corbyn candidate, and is at the Jewish Labour movement hustings. And every single candidate there said, yeah, I'm a Zionist, including Rebecca Long-Bailey. He said, no, I'm not going to put a label on myself. I don't like ists. And, this is Keir Starmer, who's rooted out anti-Semitism from the Labour Party. He just didn't want to have that label. And I think he just doesn't want to be pinned down. He says, I don't need a tattoo of someone else on my forehead to know who I am. And he is very ideologically fluid. He will adapt to whatever circumstance he's in. That doesn't mean he's given up on his values, but his ideology, he just doesn't like those sort of rigidities. Because he spent most of his working life outside politics. And I think most normal people, don't define themselves within a Labour Party story, and nor does he.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things that comes very clearly from the book, Tom, is that Starmer is quite unusual by the standards of our political class these days in having had a substantial career before entering politics, including a substantial period of time as Director of Public Prosecutions in England, a major public sector body. He has actually run stuff in the public sector in a way that previous prime ministers have not done before they entered Downing Street. To what extent do you think, I mean, and then towards the end of right at the end of the book and so on, I think you ask him, don't you, is there such a thing as Starmerism? And he has this sort of very awkward, almost painful response where he sort of says, I don't, and then I just want to get things done. Now, that's obviously quite revealing. But to what extent do you think his politics and his management of the Labour Party, and indeed perhaps the management of a government that he aspires to lead, to what extent is that going to be informed by his experiences before entering politics? The fact that he is quite a latecomer to politics and is perhaps in certain ways, an outsider who is now going to be in Downing Street.
I think it cuts through him in this way, that he doesn't have a faction. He doesn't have a sort of ideological definition, and he can move a lot faster without it. He doesn't have that baggage. I think quite a lot of people in politics think that they've got lots of friends and loyalty, and it's all about us and this side and that. I think he came into politics quite late and said, actually, you're all quite ruthless and shallow, and this is what I've got to do to get there, and I'm just going to do it without kind of dressing it up. And so there's a lot of people who've been hurt, have their feelings hurt in Labour Party by him. They thought he was an ally, then he turned out not to be an ally, or he said one thing and then he did something else. I think it's sort of he's reduced a lot of politics to its bare bones by changing Labour Party at an extraordinary speed, because he just doesn't really like politics. He just sees through it. And the sort of way we're all pretending that we like each other and we're all part of the same faction, journalists, friends, all that. I think he just doesn't want to play those games. And so how would that affect him as a prime minister? I think he constantly adapts and changes in a pragmatic way to get sometimes to a more radical place. And I think people just see him back to front. Most of politics is set up with, here is my big radical plan, and then they compromise. He starts out with often a quite straightforward, common sense, very moderate plan. And if that doesn't work, becomes progressively more radical without people noticing. And so he moves in order to get things done, but it is about getting things done. It's about outcomes rather than posture.
That's very interesting because, you have this sense of, the people who really hate Starmer are obviously the people on the Corbynite left. I mean, they hate him much more than anybody on the right does. But, if you don't have Starmerites, if you don't have a cabinet of people who are committed to your agenda for if you like intellectual or ideological reasons, or because they share your vision and so on, then when things start going wrong in government, as they always do, how deep, if you like, is the level of support for Starmer within the Labour Party, within the Labour movement, and how dependent is he therefore on on getting off to a good start, if you like? How is he going to manage the party and the movement when there's so many people who are still, after all these years, are perhaps somewhat uncertain about who is this guy? What does he truly believe in? Where does he really want to take the country?
Yeah, I think it's one of the worries that even people who are well disposed to him have sometimes, that he lacks the political skills to hold the party together when the times get very tough. And I think they all assume that they will get very tough if Labour wins power and forms a government. It's a very tough inheritance they've got. And when he talks about a decade of national renewal and puts all this emphasis on national, well, bringing people together, inspiring the country to come together, requires some sort of performative skills, which perhaps he lacks sometimes. And so I've described earlier why I think not being particularly political has allowed him to change the Labour Party at great speed. I think it's possible that the scale of the challenges may overwhelm him, or the scale of challenges may overwhelm him, particularly when much of the public still feel underwhelmed by him, if you like. The answer I think he'd give is that he does his talking on the pitch. It's always a football metaphor. And that if he can sort of get things done and prove that some things can change, that will do more to restore faith and belief in democracy, politics, the Labour Party, than any beautiful speech. And so that kind of lack of performative skills may not be a problem. The lack of coalition building skills is another thing. And Angela Rayner talks about this in my books. She says, Keir is the least political person that she knows, which is odd given that he's leader of the Labour Party. And sometimes politics is about understanding what makes people tick, if you have to bring people with you. I mean, she's one of the people who can fill that gap for him. He does learn. He's having lots more meetings with backbenchers and junior ministers now than he did, even if there's not a decision at the end. He hates that sort of thing. One last part of this is that if Labour win a majority of one, more than half the PLP would have been elected under his leadership. So we think of the PLP now as a certain sort of divide into soft left, hard left, right. It's going to have a very different nature after the next election if Labour win a majority. A lot of people owe a lot of loyalty to Keir Starmer.
Mm-hmm.
Tom, just picking up that point about you made about Angela Rayner, saying that Starmer was the least political person that she knew. I suppose it gets back to my original question about where does he stand in the Labour firmament, and you've answered that by saying he doesn't come from any ideological position. He tends to look at politics in a pragmatic way. But Labour people, even Labour people within the party, who are not necessarily tribal, they're not necessarily ideological, they look at it and say, well, at least with Wilson, we knew that he understood the constituency, the Labour constituency in the country, as did Callan, as did Foote, as did Kinnock. And I know that the constituency has now greatly changed. The charge is that Labour is now no longer a working class party, but a party of smart lawyers and liberal elites and all the rest of it. But if you can't pin somebody down, and as a voter, if you're looking at him, and there's a lot of press comment about there's no great enthusiasm for him, but they dislike the Conservatives even more. They have to feel, in terms of, insofar as you can have a relationship with a political leader, a sense of empathy and that he is on your side. I would put to you, there are sections of the Labour constituency who don't quite think he is on their side because he is aloof and he eschews ideology. And whilst you could be a prisoner of ideology, it does help sometimes to have red lines beyond which you will not compromise.
I think the on your side thing is not ideology. That's a feeling. That's a feeling which comes from values, that comes from experience. And I don't think you can define through ideology whether a politician's on your side or not. His lived experience actually takes you to one of the strongest values I think he has. And it's very important that to stress, when I say he's not ideological, he does have values. And he's not just a sort of technocrat. He's not just a pragmatist. He wants to get in a certain direction. So I think his lived experience, he once said to me, there's no point saying vote Labour because of my backstory. It's how my backstory informs my front story. And what he means by that is he understands what it's like to grow up without always being able to pay the bills because his mum and dad had a telephone cut off because they couldn't afford to pay the bills. They didn't fix the windows, which he broke with a football, because they couldn't afford it. They didn't replaster the house after a flood. They couldn't afford it. It was ramshackle. And I think that, and the sort of guilt he feels about that his brother and two sisters didn't go to university, carried on leading quite precarious lives, informs a hell of a lot about him. More so than a lot of Labour leaders who are much more easily defined ideologically. And that's why he's the first Labour leader I can remember who talks a lot about class.
Yeah.
And,
I mean,
it's not a Marxian, it's not a Marxian aspiration. It's about guilt, it's about respect, about lots of things which lots of people feel in this country. It's about values.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think that backstory, his childhood, his upbringing is fascinating, and perhaps we should delve into that a little bit more. I mean, some audiences and people who are very online and who follow politics obsessively and so on, start sniggering now when Keir Starmer says, my father was a toolmaker. But, there are a lot of less engaged voters who are hearing this sort of stuff for the first time, and they look at him and he's got a knighthood. He grew up on the Surrey-Kent border. He's been a successful barrister and so on. He sounds, in certain respects, it's easy for people to get a completely misleading idea about Keir Starmer's sort of life and background. His mother was very unwell for most of Starmer's childhood, wasn't she? And his father, sort of a difficult man, I think Starmer says, an awkward sod, is Starmer's line about his own father, isn't it? And you're right, he talks about the Labour Party being a party of working people in a way that, even Gordon Brown didn't really do so much of. And there is this sort of sense of respect and resentment. When people start laughing about things, there's a touchiness almost to some parts of Starmer's recollection or his relationship with his own upbringing, his own backstory, isn't there? A very clear sense of social stratification and hierarchy. He goes to Leeds University. He doesn't go to Oxford first, albeit he does his postgraduate stuff at Oxford. But, he'll be the first Prime Minister, assuming he's elected, to have gone to an English university that wasn't Oxford or Cambridge since Neville Chamberlain, I think. So he is a bit different.
The only one, which wasn't a Scottish university or a Dutch university. Yeah.
So, to what extent is, the idea of Keir Starmer that people have is actually rather different from the Keir Starmer that he sees himself as, isn't it?
Yeah, and the idea that he's a sort of a knight and a sort of figure of the establishment in North London, I think it's just way, way wide of the mark. The toolmaker thing about his dad. Again, he doesn't do it very well politically. He's just like, my dad was a toolmaker. But 90% of the public still don't know it, and that's why he still says it, I think. But it just is too blunt. And I think, but it's actually an amazing story because you've got this highly trained man, studied years to be a toolmaker. And toolmakers are like the kind of aristocracy of the working class because without tools, none of the factories work. And to be a toolmaker in Surrey is very different to being a toolmaker in Northern England. In Northern England, George, Scotland, the industrial area, people know what a toolmaker is. They know it's someone to respect. And in Surrey, particularly in the 70s, it's just someone who worked in a factory and factories were closing down. And that snobbery and lack of respect his father felt, I think, is part of the reason why his dad was so weird and awkward. Then also there was his mother who was so ill, and his dad absolutely dedicated to his mother and perhaps not allowing anyone else in that family to emote. So you've got this sort of class tension, you've got this resentment, you've got this very sick mother who may not be coming back from hospital every time she goes in there. You've got a brother with learning difficulties. You've got Keir Starmer desperately trying to get out, goes to grammar school, the only one of the four who goes to grammar school, doesn't bring his kids home. His house is scruffy and ramshackle. He doesn't want to talk about his sick mum at home. Doesn't have a TV at home, so he can't even talk about what was on TV that night. So goes out and plays football with his mates, so he avoids the conversation about what was on TV. It's all about getting on and getting out, but it's also this deep, deep guilt and understanding of what it's like if you don't get out. And that's a much, much more complicated story than the two-dimensional bloke that the left sneer at as Keith, which is snobbery. When the left call him Keith Starmer, you've got a lot of posh, university-educated, probably private school people sneering at a working-class leader Labour Party, and they should look at themselves a little bit in the mirror sometimes.
Tom, how do you think that these life experiences will inform his attitude towards government? Now, the manifesto, I think we can all agree, is really rather thin. There are probably two reasons why it's really rather thin. Why would you give the Tories any targets to hit during a course of an election campaign? And secondly, coming out with a bold manifesto when the fiscal headroom to do anything in terms of meaningful increases in public expenditure is almost non-existent. So let's not promise what we can't deliver. That being said, he will have to have big challenges, particularly in terms of the sustainability of public services. Wes Streeting, for example, on the NHS has talked about the need to reform as well as invest. The Blair mantra was invest and reform, although we can debate how much he actually reformed. Because Keir Starmer is not enveloped by ideology and he looks at things in a practical way, will he in government take on all vested interests, whether the vested interests are on the side of capital, or indeed, if he thinks the vested interests are on the side of Labour, trade unions, the BMA, if they're holding back what he considers to be necessary reform in public services?
There's a lot of layers to that. To just roll that back, I think you're right that the manifesto takes two very big bets on both growth and reform working. So he has this idea that just because things seem broken now, we can fix it with focus, with absolute relentless energy. That's how he's kind of run his life. He's worked harder than other people. He's more focused. He's not got this Oxbridge entitlement. He just does the work and does what's necessary to get it done. It's how he's led the Labour Party. It's very much step by step, a sort of ratchet effect, getting tighter and tighter until he gets where he wants to be. None of it's glamorous, none of it's great spectacle, but he gets where he wants to be. So the boldness is there in plain sight, I think. Those 5 missions he set out, each of them very personal to him, breaking down barriers to opportunity, faster growth, getting the NHS fit for the future, clean energy, and safer streets. Those are really big stretching missions, and also a sorting mechanism for the thousands of decisions that he has to take in government if he becomes prime minister. Now, the first iteration you see is not meant to be the last. It's meant to be, as he said, these 6 steps he published, very much sort of micro policies suggesting a sense of direction, much like Blair did in '97. People forget with those 5 pledges, everyone thought it was a great big hopey change moment. The pledge on the NHS was cutting red tape to provide £100 million more for the NHS. And Labour, of course, went on to spend hundreds of billions of pounds more on the NHS over those 13 years. So I think he will step by step do what he has to do to get closer to achieving those missions. But it's just people don't see it in the right way. It's they're kind of constantly looking for this big vision. They're constantly looking for, here's the radical blueprint that he's going to do to shake up the NHS or shake up Whitehall. And he's not like that. He feels his way. I've got this metaphor I sometimes use of this guy standing in a field on his own, stock still. And then he takes a step forward, and then he stops again, and then he takes a step to the left, and he stops again, and he takes a step backwards, he stops again, 2 steps to the right, stops, 2 steps forward, stops. I think, what is he doing? And the answer is he's crossing a minefield. And the left is so used to these charges of the Light Brigade, right? There's not to reason why, there's but to do or die. And they do die. They get
Those always
blown
end
up.
well.
This history of Labour is littered with the rotting corpses of cavalry charges that we've had. And we write folk songs about them, right? And we usually fail. For like 72 years out of the 100 years since we had a first Labour Prime Minister, we've had Tory Prime Ministers. We usually lose. And Starmer is about getting to the other side. It doesn't mean he's got no sense of direction. It just means it's inelegant. It sometimes looks confusing. It sometimes means taking steps backwards and sideways, but it is the best way to cross that minefield that he faces.
But just on that point, how will he deal with how will he deal with the left in government? I suppose a large part of this is how many Corbynistas he has within the Parliamentary Labour Party. And the answer might be, depending on the election result, not very many, in which case, certainly for the whole of a first term, he doesn't have a problem. But from time to time in government, there is always a point which comes up in the lifetime of a Labour government where there is an ideological fault line. I mean, Wilson had in place of strife in the late 1960s, and it wasn't always folk on the left that were against that. Folk like Jim Callaghan led the charge against it. How will he deal with dissent within the party? Because Alec and I were having a conversation about this the other week. In some respects, in terms of taking on the left, he stands alone in the history of Labour leaders, because even the most confrontational to date, Hugh Gaitskell, made a rapprochement with Bevan after the 59 election, but Starmer seems completely and utterly ruthless in dealing with the left, hence Jeremy Corbyn, hence Diane Abbott. So how will he deal with left eruptions, which all Labour prime ministers are normally susceptible to?
So I think there is a problem with the left. I think it's not just the hard left of the Labour Party. I think actually the soft left to the centre left of the Labour Party is going to have a problem if they don't get the growth that they need in those first 2 years. Jeremy Hunt has laid into public spending plans between 18 and 20 billion pounds of cuts. These are to services that have really been cut to the bone. Now, when I was a journalist on the Times, those first 2 years of the Labour government, last Labour government, Labour had to make £1 billion worth of cuts. And the screams of pain right across the Labour Party. You had Barbara Castle and Jack Jones on the march for the pensioners. You had single parents marching. You had public sector workers, education and health marching. And it was really tough. And that was when we had a growing economy and more revenue coming in. And so this is why he puts so much emphasis in the manifesto on growth. Because without growth, he's either going to have to raise taxes, and there's very limited room for manoeuvre there, and he doesn't want to do it, or he's going to have to make cuts. And he knows that, and he thinks he can get some growth. And don't underestimate him. The sense that, with this utter focus, this utter relentlessness, I think they will get better growth than you would have got under the Tories, because they're going to be absolutely fixated on it. So, the answer to how does he deal with the left is, I think he plans to succeed and avoid having to have these confrontations. But you're right, there will always be something there will be a confrontation about. And most prime ministers are defined by events which we don't yet know. Like, Thatcher wasn't defined properly till her second term. Blair was defined by Iraq in his second term. So I think the answer to how he will deal with the left is not that he's some sort of right-wing factional warrior. He's not. He is not part of one faction. At some points, he might be part of what's seen as a centre-left against the right at different points. I don't think it's clear how he'll play it. It depends very much on what is the best route to take to get where he wants to go. And he will chop and change. You will not have an ideological label pinned to him. There may be, at some point in the distant future, there'll be something called Starmerism, but it'll be some pattern formed by a series of judgments, like almost common law. Jurisprudence is formed only after a series of judgments are made. And he's a lawyer, right? It's not like some great big Napoleonic principle of law or Roman principles which goes in straight lines. It will fit into the curves of this country and perhaps look more like this country than lots of people who've tried to run it in recent years.
Mm-hmm. But one of the other things he says, I mean, I think that's fascinating. This sort of case law analogy, I think, is very revealing about his politics. But, there is, one of the Tory attack lines on Starmer, most of these have missed and have, some of them have sort of ricocheted and hurt the Conservatives more than they have Starmer. But there is a reasonable question, I think, about, how do you go from being the guy who in 2019 is saying Jeremy Corbyn should be Prime Minister to being the guy that kicks Jeremy Corbyn out of the Labour Party on what I think quite a lot of people who are not particularly sympathetic to Corbyn would say were relatively flimsy procedural grounds, that they were looking for an excuse, a reason, and there's a political upside for that, obviously, in terms of demonstrating to the middle 60% of the electorate that this is a different type of Labour Party, that we've absorbed the lessons of our previous defeats and so on, and we're changing, etc., etc., etc. So you've got that aspect of him, which is a sort of shape-shifting slipperiness, some people might say, or a lack of ideological conviction or consistency. And yet you've also got a Labour government that promises to be very interventionist on a whole range of issues, and will probably, in fairness, require to be very interventionist on a whole range of issues, but led by a man who also says, that I would like politics to tread a little more lightly on people's lives. And again, one could see the appeal for that, particularly after the last decade, which has been very tumultuous for all sorts of obvious reasons, and that people would like to have a little less, people would like not to have views on what the government is up to this week. But all of these things, it seems to me, again, make it quite difficult to both define Starmerism and for voters to have a real clear sense of where he wants to take the country. And therefore, if the depth, Labour's support is now very, very broad, but one wonders how deep it really is.
So, again, there's lots of different aspects to that question, but I think I know where there was also an arch. On Corbyn, I mean, look, it's interesting that the two groups of people who are really upset about it are the far left of the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, because both of them really resent that Keir Starmer has moved and changed the Labour Party for different reasons. But, the Tories would love it if Jeremy Corbyn was still in the Labour Party. It's quite odd for them now to be criticising him for kicking out someone who they said was a threat to this country's security and economy in 2019. The truth about him and Corbyn, I think, is much more complicated in that journalists have short memories. Like, between 2016, when he resigned from the front bench to try and oust Jeremy Corbyn, and 2019, no one reporting politics thinks that Jeremy Corbyn and Keir Starmer were close. No one. They wrote about rifts. They wrote about feuds. There's far more going on behind the scenes than they ever got. But they know that, Keir Starmer was, a countervailing force to what Jeremy Corbyn represented in the Labour Party. Corbyn's office knew it. The lobby knew it. Starmer's office knew it. Corbyn and Starmer knew it. Right? It's just ridiculous to pretend that they were best friends. That's rubbish. Keir Starmer was running a leadership election campaign from 2018. He had regular meetings at Jenny Chapman's house every week with a leadership team from 2018. That is not the actions of someone loyal to Jeremy Corbyn. But when he becomes leader of the Labour Party, he did not have some plan to shut Jeremy Corbyn out either. Look at what he was saying, what he did for those first 8 months. He was trying to run a unity strategy, but he adapted to the circumstances. And we talked about common law and jurisprudence. His judgment to chuck out Jeremy Corbyn in the first instance was almost like a judicial decision. He had drawn a line. He had had a conversation with Corbyn saying this is what he wanted to do. And Corbyn then issues this statement publicly, just as Keir Starmer is about to make a statement, which completely undermines what Starmer was about to say, and says that the whole thing about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party had been exaggerated. And so he had to make almost like a judicial judgment, and he said, right, we're chucking him out. Now, there were lots of moments after that when he could have been re-emitted, and there were talks going on, through the General Secretary of Communications Workers Union and Nick Brown, the Chief Whip, and all these things. But those common law judgments slowly formed into a jurisprudence. So I think it's wrong to see this grand radical strategy, a secret plan all along, to chuck out Corbyn. It evolved and then became a definitive thing. And that's the same as how he'll govern. You then had a second part of your question, which went beyond Corbyn, which I've now forgotten because I've banged on about Corbyn so long. I apologise.
Yeah, it was just the sort of thing that, Starmer looks like somebody from the 1950s, okay, in certain respects. And, there is almost a sort of nostalgia, isn't there, not for the 1950s specifically, but for an imagined time when politics was a calmer thing, and that you didn't have to have views on everything the government has done today or this week or this month. Hence his thing of, I'd like politics to be a quieter or lighter presence in people's lives. But, how you marry that with both the media atmosphere, the media realities that we have these days, and the fact that a Labour government is going to have to be very, very interventionist and activist on a whole range of issues. It seems to me that there is a tension there, even if it's also an example of how he's making a virtue, electorally speaking, of his perceived dullness. Although I think one of the things that comes out of your book is that Starmer is a much more interesting person than most people really think he is.
Yeah, I mean, he doesn't like being called dull either. He resents it. But,
well, not many people do, in fairness.
He said, I'm not dull. My friends don't think I'm dull. So he knows it can be politically advantageous at times. He can sometimes see himself almost forcing himself to accept a proposition, but he really doesn't like it. Look, the purpose of your question is almost like, is there a contradiction between someone saying they want politics to have a lighter touch, lighter feel on people's lives, and someone who wants an active interventionist state? And in some ways, you're right. I think that interventionism and that concept of state is actually quite old-fashioned. It goes back to the 60s and 70s, and we haven't had it really since Thatcher and Blair and Brown didn't believe in a big industrial strategy. They didn't believe in creating markets. They believed in occasionally regulating markets, but even then quite light touch. And this is different, and this is probably more classically left wing. So is the sense of, some places sort of common ownership or renationalising railways or publicly owned British Energy. I think there are lots of aspects of him which do speak to that past. When he talks about the sort of ordinary hope of the 1970s, the sense of being able to get on and life will just get a bit better for you and your kids without sort of being transformed. And I suppose the answer is when he talks about politics being sort of less in your life and a sort of sense of crisis and drama being less apparent and people just getting on with their lives, is this, that he just hates the spectacle of politics. This sort of sense of hysterical drama that we get from so much political journalism. It's like another existential crisis. Everything becomes so sort of febrile, and the things that are supposedly kind of going to threaten the future of our nation, some desperate refugees crossing the channel in small boats and our whole world will collapse, or putting VAT on private school fees and the whole way of life will change. Just calm down. No drama, Starmer. That sense of there are things we can do, and a lot of it's going to be quite boring. So when he was head of the CPS, in charge of 8,000 civil servants, he did an interview with Civil Service World, and he talked about a reform he's really proud of, which was moving from paper files to digital files. And he said this was actually groundbreaking, major reform, which in the history of British justice. And it did improve justice. It meant people less likely to have the paperwork lost. It sped up the cases. Justice delayed is justice denied. And it changed people's lives. But it's not a great headline. It's not this great big radical plan, right? And other DPPs say it was a bit boring, a bit technocratic. They had plans to sort of shake up the CPS. Now he's interested in moving to digital files. And when he talks about, sorting out, small boats, he says a big part of the solution isn't building a wall in the channel or jet skis or Rwanda. It's about employing more civil servants to process asylum applications faster so that you can then send them back to safe countries, and then having good conversations with other countries about, returns. And that's really boring. And there's no headlines.
This is Starmer as plumber or electrician, isn't it?
Yeah, and when your house is being flooded, you don't want someone to come and make a great speech. You want someone to fix the plumbing. Right? So much of our politics has been spectacle. I think it's important, but I make this point at the end of my book. We've had, Tony Blair. I've said this quite a few times, so I apologise if you've heard this, but I think it's important. Tony Blair, for all his great qualities, conjured up visions of castles in the sky, which didn't always get beyond the artist's impression. Boris Johnson set fire to lots of things we value and gathered a huge crowd around him going ooh and ah. And Keir Starmer talks about building blocks, and he puts one building block on top of another, and it's boring to watch, and people turn their backs, and then they come back and they found he's built a house. And that's the difference in terms of his approach.
Tom, looking ahead, the one thing that the new Labour government will need is time, because it will take time to get economic growth. From the economic growth, they can start setting about some of the challenges which the public services face. You said earlier on, in terms of a 10-year plan, let me put it to you that he has a reasonable prospect, if he has a landslide after the 4th of July, of getting that second term, because now is the time for all good right-wingers in Britain to come to wreck the cause. And what we're now seeing with Reform UK and the challenge of Farage to the Conservatives in the polls, and the long-term objective of Farage is not to, in some respects, move the Conservative Party just a little bit notch to the right. Everybody knows that it's about taking it beyond the issue of immigration, beyond the issue of taking back control, and running a much smaller state, which would mean radically changing the National Health Service, driving a coach and horses. So some of those values that you've been talking about that Keir Starmer actually embraces, that for the first time, actually in a very long time, perhaps for the first time, a Labour government is going to be able to look over its shoulder to what is happening on the political right to find the kind of internecine warfare which Labour's history has always bended the knee to, because Labour history, in a sense, is a history of division punctuated by periods in government. He might get his 10 years because at the end of the day, his values will chime with a political right, which with a rush of ideological blood to the head is taking the right off in a way that not even the Tory party from Macmillan to Thatcher would possibly understand or possibly agree with.
But I think that's a longer term process in the Tory party. I mean, I think why David Cameron came in as a modernising centrist Tory after the Tory party's previous lurch to the right under William Hague and Ian Duncan Smith had gone wrong. David Cameron felt he had to appease his party on Europe. He had to take the opportunity to shrink the state after 2010. He offered a referendum on Brexit. That's never enough. You give them that, then you give them Brexit, and they want more red meat, and it's all And the internal dynamic of the Conservative Party has transformed this country, in my view, for the worse. And that's because the Conservative Party has become ideological and has been driven by its membership. And when the Labour Party is driven by its membership, it heads to the left too. We saw that under Corbyn. And Starmer talks about turning Labour inside out. So it doesn't face the electorate, the activists, it faces the electorate instead. And that's why he's been able to occupy this solid centre ground when Rishi Sunak, who initially looked like he was going to contest it, has been dragged off into the marshlands of Conservative nut jobs. And if the Tories lose this election badly, I think it's pretty inevitable that if the membership is involved in that leadership election, there's more than one candidate, you will see the Conservative Party drifting further to the right. And you're right, Farage could be a big factor in that. So yes, Labour has an opportunity to occupy that centre ground, even though it's a pretty bumpy centre ground in the next few years. What's happening around the world, what's happening with the economy, what's happening with foreign affairs, war in Ukraine, war in Gaza, China, possible Donald Trump 2.0. There's lots and lots of massive challenges, climate change, refugees, technology. These are hugely difficult problems. But if your opponent is just stabbing itself in the face with a fork again and again and again, you may well look more electable than the other one. The bigger question is whether he actually means it, about whether he does want to govern for the whole country. And I was at Grimsby Town Football Club with him last week, and he's doing this round table with people. And he said something I thought was really interesting. He said, look, most people in this country don't really care about politics. They don't care whether you're Labour or Tory or Liberal Democrat or SNP or whatever. That's not part of their conversation. Only people like us talk about politics all the time. And that goes back to your question about wearing politics a bit more lightly. Most people in their communities want the community, their country to succeed. And they're not saying, but is he Labour? Is he Tory? And so he genuinely says, I want to work with reasonable people who can do stuff and make stuff better, whatever party they're from. And in that sense, I think he could be a kind of almost Stanley Baldwin figure of the left. No relation to me, I stress. Through the 30s, Stanley Baldwin looked and felt like England, well, not Scotland, but England. Mm-hmm. And I think people sort of recognise that. And the Labour Party, with its ideologies and activists and glorious defeats, I don't think has always looked and felt like this country. And I think Starmer, because he isn't that political, he doesn't really like politicians, could be Labour's version of that. Although, as I said earlier, My qualification is the challenges are so enormous, and he does need perhaps more political skills than he's sometimes shown to address some of those challenges, that he could be overwhelmed by all this. But there is potential, you're right, for a long period of Labour hegemony if they get this right.
I think that's a fascinating notion. The idea of Starmer as a Labour Baldwin is something that quite a lot of old-fashioned Conservative voters with a sense of history could find appealing. I think that's also probably an appropriate spot at which to end this. Thank you so much for coming on the show to talk about Starmer. Tom, your biography is the essential guide to the man most likely to be our new Prime Minister. Again, I think he's a more interesting man with a more interesting background and life story than many of the caricatures of Starmer that we see from both left and right would lead us to believe. I thoroughly recommend your book, and thank you so much for joining us on the Ponsonby and Massey podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Tom, we got our Labour Baldwin. He's called Tom. It's been a fascinating discussion. And I think for a lot of people, particularly actually a lot of Labour activists who ask themselves the question, what does he really stand for? We can't place him. Well, we've had a lot of answers tonight. He's a pragmatist. He will do what he thinks is right. He will do what he thinks will work. But he will always be governed by the experiences of his own background and the values that have helped shape him. So for that, Labour's Tom Baldwin, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And Alex and I will be back with the next podcast pretty shortly.
Thank you very much.